right, good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Mallory Howard. I'm the assistant curator here at the Mark Twain House Museum. So hello to everyone in person and then our very large virtual audience as well. So before we get started, I'm going to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Kerry Driscoll, who's a dear friend of the museum. She's the professor of English Emerita at the University of St. Joseph in West Hartford, is now an associate editor at the Mark Twain Papers and Project at the University of California, Berkeley. Kerry is a longtime Twain scholar and the author of Mark Twain Among the Indians and Other Indigenous Peoples, the first book-length study of the writer's vexed representations of Native peoples over the course of his 50-year career. In 2022, she received the Mark Twain Circle of America's Louis J. Budd Award for Distinguished Scholarship in recognition of the groundbreaking nature of her research. She has worked closely with the Mark Twain House Museum for almost 20 years and served on the Board of Trustees from 2017 to 2023. And before I invite Kerry up, I just want to thank our sponsors, Connecticut Humanities and the Center for Mark Twain Studies in Elmira. And I will also highly encourage you to check out our exhibit if you haven't yet, which is on Mark Twain and his family's summer travels, of which Kerry was an integral part of helping us put it together. So with that, I would like to introduce her.
In November 1905, on the eve of his 70th birthday, Mark Twain was interviewed by a reporter from the New York Times. As the men conversed, he astonished the journalist by declaring that despite having written and published more than 20 books over the course of his career, he was essentially a lazy man who had never done a day's work. No, sir, not a day's work in all my life. What I have done because it has been play. If it had been work, I shouldn't have done it. The dichotomy Twain proposes here between work and play merits some investigation, since as anyone who has stared forlornly at a blank screen trying to write a college essay due the next morning knows, writing is indeed hard work, grinding, nerve-wracking, stressful work, at least for most of us. For Mark Twain, the concept of work was closely correlated with physical exertion, whereas intellectual labor, the engagement of one's mind or imagination, was deemed a source of pleasure, hence play. As he explains in A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, intellectual work is misnamed. It is a pleasure, a dissipation, and its own highest reward. The poorest paid architect, engineer, general, author, sculptor, painter, lecturer, advocate, legislator, actor, preacher, singer, is constructively in heaven when he is at work. And as for the magician, with the fiddle bow in his hand when he sits in the midst of a great orchestra with the ebbing and flowing tides of divine sound washing over him, why certainly he is at work, if you wish to call it that. But Lord, it's a sarcasm just the same. This distinction between work and play is brilliantly illustrated in the iconic scene in Tom Sawyer, when Aunt Polly punishes Tom for playing hooky by making him whitewash her fence on a glorious Saturday morning. Tom, however, subverts her plan by devising a clever scheme to get others to do the chore for him by pretending it's fun and charging them for the privilege to boot. By the end of the morning, the fence gleams with 3 coats of whitewash, and Tom has amassed a hoard of treasure. At this point, Mark Twain informs the reader, Tom had discovered a great law of human action without knowing it, namely that in order to make a man or boy covet a thing, it is only necessary to make the thing difficult to attain. If he had been a great and wise philosopher, like the writer of this book, he would now have comprehended that work consists of whatever a body is obliged to do, and that play consists of whatever a body is not obliged to do. The key word here, to my mind, is the verb oblige. to be legally or morally bound to perform a certain task or action. In Tom Sawyer's case, the source of this obligation is obvious and external, the parental authority embodied in Aunt Polly. But in Mark Twain's professional life, the question of exactly to whom or what he was obliged is more complicated. More often than not, he was under contract with a publisher to produce a certain number of words by a specific date, external forces or obligations, which theoretically should have stifled his creativity, but did not. In an autobiographical dictation on August 30th, 1906, Twain described his manner of writing and the mysterious sources of his creativity this way. As long as a book would write itself, I was a faithful and interested amanuensis, and my industry did not flag. But the minute that book tried to shift to my head, the labor of contriving its situations, inventing its adventures, and conducting its conversations, I put it away and dropped it out of my mind. It was by accident that I found out that a book is pretty sure to get tired along about the middle and refuse to go on with its work until its powers and its interest should have been refreshed by a rest and its depleted stock of raw materials reinforced by lapse of time. It was when I had reached the middle of Tom Sawyer that I made this invaluable find. At page 400 of my manuscript, the story made a sudden and determined halt and refused to proceed another step. I knew quite well that the tale was not finished, and I could not understand why I was not able to go on with it. The reason was very simple. My tank had run dry. It was empty. The stock of materials in it was exhausted. The story could not go on without materials. It could not be wrought out of nothing. It was then that I made the great discovery that when the tank runs dry, you've only to leave it alone and it will fill up again in time while you are asleep. Also, while you are at work on other things and are quite unaware that this unconscious and profitable cerebration is going on. There was plenty of material now, and the book went on and finished itself without any trouble. Mark Twain's famous description of his tank, an unconscious wellspring of inspiration that he mysteriously taps into, channels through his pen and out onto the page, placing himself in the position of a mere scribe or amanuensis, closely aligns with Carl Jung's notion of an extroverted creator. This type of artist experiences the creative process not as a deliberate, willful act, but an overwhelming flood of thoughts and images. According to Jung, an extroverted artist is, and I'm quoting, subordinate to his or her work and stands outside it as though he were a second person, or in Twain's analogy, an amanuensis. Once a book shifted to his head, meaning to conscious control, it ceased to be play and became labor, and the tank of inspiration would inevitably run dry. This theory of creativity is fundamentally optimistic, grounded in the belief that the imagination is an inexhaustible resource. Given patience and time, the tank will inevitably replenish itself while you are asleep, also while you are at work on other things and are quite unaware that this unconscious and profitable cerebration is going on. Clemens made much the same argument to Reverend George Bainton in response to an 1888 inquiry about his methods of composition. Doubtless, I have methods, but they begot themselves, in which case I am only their proprietor, not their father. He refers to an automatically working taste, a taste which selects and rejects without asking you for any help. Excuse me, and patiently and steadily improving itself without troubling you to approve or applaud. Yes, and likely enough, when the structure is at last pretty well up and attracts attention, you feel complimented, whereas you didn't build it and didn't even consciously superintend. As in the 1906 autobiographical dictation, creativity is characterized as external and apart, the product of an automatically working taste that does not ask the conscious self for any help. Early on in his career, Clemens could write anywhere, oblivious to physical discomfort, distractions, and the inevitable interruptions occasioned by the proximity of others. I'm just going to get some water. As his Quaker City roommate, Dan Sloat, recalled some years after the 1867 cruise, Mark Twain's work ethic and ability to focus on that journey were remarkable. When we were out on the Holy Land expedition, he was the hardest working man I ever saw. Why, out in Egypt, where the fleas were so thick you couldn't breathe without swallowing 1,000, that man used to sit up and write half the night. I used to have to go get my clothes off in a second and hustle into bed before any of the fleas had a chance to get between the sheets. And as I was vainly trying to get to sleep, I'd say to Clemens, "Sam, how the deuce can you stand it to write out there among the fleas?" "Oh, I'm all right," Sam would say. "They've pretty much got a railroad track eaten around both ankles, and they keep in that pretty much, so I don't bother with them." In early 1868, during his brief tenure as a secretary to Nevada Senator William Stewart, Clemens revised and expanded his original travel letters to the Alta California to produce The Innocents Abroad. He worked in the cramped quarters where he lived, a rented room in a Washington, D.C. boarding house. According to one of his fellow lodgers, the physical conditions in which he wrote were chaotic, filled with dirt, disorder, and of course, a thick haze of tobacco smoke. This squalor did not impede his creativity, but rather seemed to fuel it. There was Mark Twain in a little back room with a sheet iron stove, a dirty, musty carpet of the cheapest description, a bed, and 2 or 3 common chairs. The little drum stove was full of ashes, running over on the zinc sheet, and the bed seemed to be unmade for a week. The slops had not been carried out for a fortnight. The room was foul with tobacco smoke. The floor, dirty enough to begin with, was littered with newspapers from which Twain had cut his letters. Then there were hundreds of pieces of torn manuscripts which had been written and then rejected by the author. A dozen pipes were about the apartment, on the washstand, on the mantel, on the writing table, on the chairs. Everywhere that room could be found. And there was tobacco, and tobacco everywhere. One thing, there were no flies. The smoke killed them, and I am now surprised the smoke did not kill me, too. He would strip down to his suspenders, his coat and vest, of course, being off, and walk backward and forward in slippers in his little room, and swear and smoke the whole day long. Of course, at times he did work, and when he did work, it was like a steam engine at full head. Here is True Williams's illustration of Mark Twain composing his book that appears in The Innocents Abroad. You can get a sense of some of the swirl of that chaos. Once Clemens's bachelor days ended, however, finding the time, space, and most importantly, inspiration to write became more of a challenge. He composed Roughing It under extremely difficult personal circumstances: a premature baby, a sickly wife, and a constant parade of doctors, nurses, and caregivers. Perhaps not surprisingly, his tank would not cooperate, as he confided to Mary Mason Fairbanks a few weeks after his wedding, causing him to feel like a draft horse straining to pull a burdensome load. Every day, I nerve myself and seize my pen and dispose my paper and prepare to buckle on the harness and work. And then I pace the floor back and forth with a vacuous mind. And finally, I lay down the pen and confess that my time has not come, that I am utterly empty, but I must work, and I will work. I will go straight at it and force it. I used to do it every day of my life between Gibraltar and the Bermudas, and of course it can be done again. And it was so hard then. Will it be so now? Worse, maybe. Beleaguered by the pressures of a looming deadline to submit his manuscript, he told his publisher, Elisha Bliss, in March 1871, "Out of the infernal, damnable chaos I am whirling in at home, I snatch a moment to reply. In 3 whole months, I have hardly written a page of manuscript. You do not know what it is to be in a state of absolute frenzy, desperation. I had rather die twice over than repeat the last 6 months of my life." Mark Twain discovered the ideal conditions in which his creativity could thrive thanks to his sister-in-law, Susan Crane, who in the spring of 1874 surprised him with the gift of an airy study set on the hillside above her farmhouse at Quarry Farm in New York, where the Clemens family spent nearly 20 summers. This is the earliest known photo of the study, taken by Elmira photographer Elisha Van Aken on the 29th of July, 1874, showing how the area had been clear-cut during construction, allowing sweeping vistas of the valley below and the mountains to the south. If you look very closely through the window, a figure, doubtlessly Mark Twain, can be seen seated at a desk. Here is a stereoscopic view made the same day of the study through the vine-clad arches of an arbor situated further up the hillside. A second stereo view of the building's interior shows a carefully posed image of the writer at work. Within a few years of the study's completion, as Clara Clemens remembered, this charming sort of Peter Pan house grew covered with ivy and surrounded by beautiful wildflowers and morning glories, as this photograph taken sometime during the 1880s illustrates. In a June 1874 letter to his Hartford minister, Joe Twitchell, Clemens rhapsodized about this cozy nest. "Susie Crane has built the loveliest study for me you ever saw. It is octagonal with a peaked roof, each octagon filled with a spacious window, and it sits perched in complete isolation on top of an elevation that commands leagues of valley and city and retreating ranges of distant blue hills. It is a cozy nest, with just room in it for a sofa and a table and 3 or 4 chairs. And when the storms sweep down the remote valley and the lightning flashes above the hills beyond, and the rain beats upon the roof over my head, imagine the luxury of it." As this quotation suggests, the study's lofty elevation and the opportunity thus afforded for reverie was integral to its magic. And that's a 19th century view looking down into the Chemung River Valley from the study. "Perched away up here on top of the hill near heaven," he told his Hartford attorney, Charles Perkins, "I have the feeling of being sort of a scrub angel and am more moved to help shove the clouds around and get the stars on deck properly and keep all things trim and shipshape in the firmament than to bother myself with the humble insect interests and occupations of the distant earth." That September, Twain offered a description of his working habits in a letter to his Scottish friend, Dr. John Brown. "On hot days, I spread the study wide open, anchor my papers with brickbats, and write in the midst of the hurricanes, clothed in the same thin linen we make shirt bosoms of. The study is nearly at the peak of the hill. It is right in front of the little arbor, roofed with bark and covered with the vine you call the American creeper. It's green, already bloodied with red. The study is 30 yards below the old arbor and 100 yards above the dwelling place. It is remote from all noises. Comfortably dressed, braced by the exhilarating tonic of fresh air swirling around him, remote from all noises other than birdsong and rustling leaves. These were the optimal conditions for Mark Twain to exercise his creative genius. And thrive it did. Writing to his mother in July 1883 about his progress on Huckleberry Finn, he said, "I haven't had such booming working days for many years. I am piling up manuscript in a really astonishing way. I believe I shall complete in 2 months a book I have been fooling over for 7 years. This summer, it is no more trouble for me to write than it is to lie." The painstaking, often grueling process of revision, altogether beyond the scope of this talk, would come later. But what I find most intriguing about the Quarry Farm study is not its relative isolation or bucolic vistas, but the balance it afforded between solitude and sociability. The writer's habit of sharing his latest work with his family on the porch each night after dinner and gauging its success on the basis of their response is, of course, well known. He was not sequestered in a garret, cut off from all human contact, but paradoxically apart, while simultaneously enmeshed in the fabric of community. His solitary flights of imagination were tempered and, I would argue, sustained by re-immersion into domestic reality, where the products of his pen were translated into the dynamic, interactive medium of oral storytelling. Clemens's niece, Ida Langdon, recalls that when Mark Twain was writing The Prince and the Pauper, there were frequent, welcome interruptions when his daughters, sometimes accompanied by their cousins and friends, would, by pre-arrangement, come trooping silently into the quiet zone maintained around the little octagon late in the afternoon. If he were ready for them, he would call out. Sometimes they were not on the spot, and he blew a horn for them. And in breathless excitement, they would gather around him on the study steps to hear the newest chapter of this story that they passionately loved. The idyllic conditions of the Quarry Farm study were so conducive to Mark Twain's creativity that he actually sought to replicate them in other locations. In April 1878, the Clemens family left Hartford for a 16-month stay in Europe, living in Germany, Italy, and France. They arrived in Heidelberg on May 6th and took a suite of rooms at the Schloss Hotel. And this is an illustration of that hotel right up at the top of the hill from A Tramp Abroad. The Schloss Hotel was just adjacent to the magnificent castle ruins set on a steep hill above the city and above the river. So this is a contemporary photograph, right, taken from the environs of the Schloss Hotel, which now is very, very expensive condominiums, of the castle, and then down into the Altstadt and across the river. Almost immediately, Mark Twain rented a writing den on the opposite side of the Neckar River to create some distance between what he termed home attractions and distractions. Within a few short weeks, however, he grew dissatisfied because, as he explained to his Hartford friend, Charles Dudley Warner, it was no exercise to trot down there, and the exercise of climbing up here, meaning to the hotel again, was valueless because I got it at the wrong end of the day. It was lonesome, too, and far removed from beer. In other words, walking down to his place of work and then back up to the hotel at the end of the day inverted the rhythm to which he had grown accustomed in Elmira. His remedy? A new space. This is a page from Clemens's 1878 notebook, right? June 4th, rented and paid for a room for a month, right? At the pretty little Wirtschaft under the Königstuhl. So much like the Quarry Farm study, right, the Schloss Hotel was not at the highest elevation on the hill above Heidelberg, right? It was about midway, so there was an even steeper rise beyond the Schloss Hotel to a mountain that's called the Königstuhl. Okay, So notice the juxtaposition of the two statements on this page, right? That, okay, I rented another room. Chapter 8 begins with 93, right? There's the business-like tone, of a professional writer, right? I've got an agenda, I've got this room, and I'm going to start on chapter 8, right? But here's how he described his new work den a few pages later in the same letter to Warner. I have moved my den clear up on the very pinnacle of the Kaiserstuhl. Got the name wrong a little bit. 1,400 or 1,500 feet up in the air above the Schloss Hotel, and 1,700 above the Rhine Valley, which it overlooks. I have the only room in the little Wirtschaft there not lived in by the family. I start to climb the mountain every morning about 10 or a little after. I loaf along the steep sides, cogitating and smoking, rest occasionally, and peer out through the ragged windows in the dense foliage upon the fair world below, then trudge further to another resting place, always with an attentive ear to the pleasant woodland sounds, the manifold music of the birds, and finally reach my den about noon, feeling pretty gorgeous and at peace with the world. I treat myself to a blast of the summit breeze and a 5 minutes contemplation of the great Rhine Plains' slumbering sea of mottled tints and shades, and then shut myself up tight and fast in my noiseless den and go to work. About 4 p.m. I take beer and listen to the family's domestic news, or get one of the young girls to pilot me through some conjugations and declensions, or hold the book while I curse the dative case. Then, about 5 or 5:15, I go loafing down the mountain again, find Livy and Clara, her friend Clara Spalding, not his daughter, all right, in the castle park, and listen to the band in the shadow of the ruin. Notice the uncanny similarity of Twain's language in describing the environs of his Heidelberg workspace to earlier letters about the Quarry Farm study. Sweeping views of a river valley, peering through dense foliage out into the fair world below, the blast of the summit breeze, and peaceful woodland sounds. Indeed, he was so charmed by the new location that he also wrote about it in a letter to Bayard Taylor, who was then serving as the U.S. minister to Prussia. Yes, we still live at the Schloss Hotel, and shall doubtless continue to do so until the neighborhood of August. But I only eat and sleep there. My work den is in the second story of a little Wirtschaft, which stands at the base of the tower on the summit of the Königstuhl. I walk up there every morning at 10, write until 3, talk the most hopeless and unimprovable German with the family until 5, then tramp down to the hotel for the night. It is a sehr schönes Aussicht, a very beautiful view up there, as you may remember. The exercise of climbing up there is invigorating, but devilish. An unpublished story in the Mark Twain papers, dated June 6, 1878, and tentatively titled The Lost Earring by Albert Bigelow Paine, is set at the Königstuhl Wirtschaft and reveals its inevitable shortcomings in relation to Quarry Farm. Though it undeniably offered the requisite distance and separation from his family, the sociability of the space was a bit more than the writer had bargained for. Occupying the only room on the premises not inhabited by the owners, he lacked the privacy of his Elmira study and was therefore prone to diversion and distraction. Arriving to work one morning in early June, he found himself irresistibly drawn into an intimate domestic drama unfolding in real time among 3 generations of the household's women. Oops, sorry, missed one of my slides. Okay, here's the beginning, page 1 of the story. I reached the little house on the peak of the Königstuhl this morning about 11. As I stepped into the small living room, Fräulein Marie stepped into the same room from the kitchen. Her head was down. She raised it and showed such a heartbroken face. Her eyes were dim with tears, which she was trying hard to keep from flowing. The mother, the two sisters, the good old stocking knitter, presuming that's the grandmother, and I all sprang forward with one impulse and one exclamation of distress and sympathy. "Oh, child, what has happened?" She could not speak, but she touched one of her earrings with one forefinger and laid her other forefinger eloquently upon the remains of the other, and her tale was told. 2/3 of the pendant was broken off and lost. They were simple jewels, these earrings, and had not cost what a lady pays for a pair of kid gloves in America, but they were precious to the owner, for she was not rich in such things. Although an outsider in terms of his class, nationality, and gender, the narrator vicariously shares in the pain of Marie's experience. But mindful of his professional responsibilities, he politely extricates himself from the conversation and hurries off to his upstairs room. My work was urgent, so I went upstairs and set myself at it, but I could get no life into it. This house was a house of mourning, and there was no getting away from the sense of it. To argue that nothing was the matter except that an almost costless trifle had been lost was an easy thing to do, but it did no good after it was done. There was no arguing away the fact that the only real thing about affliction is the affliction itself. The cause of it is not a thing to be considered. The loss of a king's crown and a young girl's trinket weigh just the same in the scales of the angel of calamity. These lines offer an important insight into Mark Twain's creative sensibility, his keen and absorptive receptivity of mind, soaking in all the facets of the life surrounding him. He fails to get life into his pages precisely because the immediacy of Fräulein Marie's affliction dominates, in fact overrides, his pre-existing intentions, which seem dull and abstract by comparison. The writer philosophically interrogates the nature of his distraction, realizing that all afflictions weigh just the same in the scales of the angel of calamity. After 3 hours of futile chair time, I judged that I had worked enough, so I went downstairs and struck into the road which leads through the beech wood. The old stocking knitter was in her usual nook among the trees, plying her needles. The face bent over the work was sorrowful, so I knew the season of mourning continued. Just as the narrator turns to leave, however, Fräulein Marie triumphantly reappears with a radiant face, holding up the glittering object and uttering never a word. She then explains that the missing piece of her earring had fallen into her apron pocket, to which the old stocking knitter replies, "The ways of God are wonderful." The story concludes with this line: "My friend, the reader, is privileged to imagine for himself what the rejoicing in the homestead was like when we all ran thither. It is beyond my art to paint it." And yet, ironically, the very existence of the text demonstrates that it was not at all beyond Mark Twain's ability to capture or paint the day's dramatic events. This unpublished work, among countless others at the Mark Twain Papers, offers another insight into the writer's creative process, namely that any incident, no matter how random or apparently insignificant, could be profitably seized for its literary potential. Although he may not have made any progress on chapter 9 of the manuscript of The Tramp Abroad that day, as he intended, his time, energy, and imagination were not at all squandered. In the years following his Heidelberg experience, Mark Twain sought out other rented quarters where he could write during the summer: Onteora, New York, Saranac Lake, and Dublin, New Hampshire, to mention a few. As he explained to his New York Times interviewer in 1905. I have tried a number of summer homes here and in Europe. Each of these homes had charms and delights of its own, and some of them, even in Europe, had conveniences too. They all had a view, right? A sehr schönes Aussicht. It is my conviction that there should always be some water in a view, a lake or a river, but not the ocean, if you are down on its level. I think when you are down on its level, it seldom inflames you with an ecstasy which you could not get out of a sand flat. He continues, the summer homes are high-perched, as a rule, and have contenting outlooks. The house we occupy in Dublin, New Hampshire, has one. Monadnock, a soaring double hump, rises into the sky at its left elbow. Sorry. From the base of the slant of the mountain, the valley spreads away to the circling frame of hills, and beyond the frame, the billowy sweep of remote great ranges rise to view and flow, fold upon fold, wave upon wave, soft and blue and otherworldly, to the horizon 50 miles away. The backdrop of this 1906 photo of the writer seated on the porch of his Dublin house provides a vague sense of that soft, blue, unworldly vista that enchanted him. However, this contemporary image conveys its scale more powerfully. In the final years of his life, Mark Twain discovered the ultimate cozy nest for reverie and creation, his bed. The practice, as he explained to the Times reporter, originated in a bout of illness. Whenever I've got some work to do, I go to bed. I got into that habit some time ago when I had an attack of bronchitis. Suppose your bronchitis lasts 6 weeks. The first 2, you can't do much but attend to the barking. But the last 4, I found I could work if I stayed in bed. Work in bed is a pretty good gospel, at least for a man who's come, like me, to the time of life when his blood is easily frosted. If you're sitting at a desk, you get excited about what you're doing. And the first thing you know, the steam heat or the furnace has raised the temperature until you've almost got a fever, or the fire in the grate goes out and you get a chill. Or if somebody comes in to attend the fire, he interrupts you and gets you off the trail of that idea you are pursuing. And so I go to bed. I can keep an equable temperature there without trying and go about my work without being bothered. Ever the provocateur, Mark Twain invited photographers into his private sanctum on Fifth Avenue. The following 3 images, taken on the same occasion in early 1906, appeared in the Literary Digest, it's a magazine, on April 28th. Curiously, not in a feature about Mark Twain himself, but as illustrations accompanying an article on the Russian writer Maxim Gorky, who was then visiting New York on a Bolshevik fundraising trip. The incongruity between these images and the captions assigned to them is telling in terms of the writer's concepts of work and play. Portrayed in comfortable repose, clad only in pajamas, propped up against his snowy bed pillows and smoking a cigar, surrounded by all manners of accoutrements, pipes, newspapers, books, writing utensils, and if I'm not mistaken, a carafe of whiskey as well. This, the reader is informed, is how Mark Twain works. Here, pen in hand, notebook propped on his knee, he is allegedly waiting for a word. And lastly, simply at work. Soon after the issue's publication, Clemens received a letter from a stranger, a man named Thomas Miranda, who told him something surprising. I do not know if you noticed the optical illusion in the photo of yourself published in the Digest some weeks ago. I have marked it, and it represents a little child whispering in your ear as you write. If this is the illusion, and in truth, the truth, then it is no wonder that your writings are liked by all. Surely anyone who is inspired by the whisperings of a child can write only which is good for the soul. Intrigued, Clemens immediately contacted Clara in Manhattan and requested, if any of these photographs are in the house, examine them and see if you can detect this night-gowned child that is whispering in my ear. There are 3 different negatives, but the child is in them all. 6 months later, the photo was reproduced in a December 8th issue of Harper's Weekly, alongside a pen and ink sketch by illustrator L.J. Bridgman, captioned "The Musing Sage" and then the drawing, all right, the accidental little girl in the pillow. The piece also included Bridgman's short, and I have to admit, dreadful poem entitled "To Mark Twain." Is it strictly a secret, the little maid tells, as she mingles her hair with your own? If it isn't, I'm sure there are lots of your friends who are hoping you'll let it be known. Is she haply a muse, just a little girl muse who helps out while her mother is snoozing? Why, of course she's a muse. She was caught in the act, for I certainly found her amusing. Feel free to groan here. A colorized version of this same photo, made into a triptych with painterly scenes of 2 iconic landscapes closely associated with Twain's work, the Mississippi River and American West, appeared in a lavishly illustrated art monthly called the Burr Macintosh magazine in December 1906, entitled, and I don't know if the print is so small you can't read it, Mark Twain on his 70th birthday, Still at Work. Clemens sent a copy of this print to Henry Huddleston Rogers' wife, Emily, soon after. And if you look at the handwriting up at the very top, inscribed with the image, "Dear Mrs. Rogers, find the little child whispering in my ear." The image and poem were later made into a color postcard by Raphael Tuck and Sons and sold widely both in the United States and abroad. This optical illusion, however sentimentalized, literally embodies Mark Twain's notion of an unconscious writing process in which he served as the amanuensis of his novels and short stories rather than their origin. Up until the time of his death, he insisted. My life for the past 35 years has really been nothing more or less than one long holiday with 3 months scribbling in each year, which other people dignified with the great name of work, but which to me was not work at all, but only play, delicious play. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Kerry. That was wonderful. And we have some time to take some questions from the audience, so I'm going to start with our live audience, and then we'll go to our virtual viewers. So does anyone in the live audience have any questions for Kerry? Any questions? Al. So Al asked, how much fun did you have writing this?
I had a lot of fun. It is just an almost unimaginable blessing to work at the Mark Twain Papers and to be able to go into that vault and rummage around. I mean, the things that I found, the story of the lost earring, I stumbled upon that, not because I was looking for it, but then it caught my attention. And the same thing with the various photographs, you know, the letter texts, I've certainly read a lot of Mark Twain's letters, but I haven't read them all. And so, the discovery of like that wonderful letter to Charles Dudley Warner, is just such a revelation. And so it was, long story short, it was a lot of fun to write.
Any other questions from our live audience, or in person, I should say? Oh, okay. I know we have some
We have a
virtual.
couple.
Yep. So Jody.
So the first one is, it doesn't sound like it, but were there other authors that Twain modeled his work ethic on at any point in his career?
Not to my knowledge. I mean, something that I didn't get into in this presentation is, there's certainly a pretty strong element of self-mythologizing in all of this, and I hope you notice the contradiction between the quote where he's describing how torturous it was to try to write Roughing It, just, oh, delicious play, right? I didn't work a day in my life. Not so much. So, he's fashioning, this is part of a very carefully constructed public image, all right, that he wants to present. So I don't, the answer to that question is I don't know, not that I'm aware of.
All right. We have a question here. Yes.
Kind of following on with that, Twain was up in the mountains doing his work, doing the best of his work and stuff. And Melville also was
That's right.
kind of mountain-ish, or at least inspired by a mountain.
Yes.
Did Twain have any, he and Melville have any kind of connection or any kind of, did Twain look at Melville, who was a little bit earlier than Twain, and say, hey, that might be something that's working for me at all? I mean, is there any kind of connection between those two writers? I mean, it seems similar
Yeah.
with what inspired them to write.
Right. The white whale.
So the question is there a connection between Melville and Twain? Just for our audience at home.
I have never run across one. That doesn't mean that one doesn't exist, but in my reading and range of experience, no, not that I'm aware of.
Okay, Jody, back to you.
So the next one is from our glorious friend, John Pascal. He asks, what is your favorite work of Twain and why?
Oh, boy.
An easy question.
Oh, I have to say, well, I'm going to say The Innocents Abroad. As much as I dearly love Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, because The Innocents Abroad is his first book, and, it's Mark Twain before he got tamed. There are still things in the pages of that book in terms of really politically incorrect descriptions that he gives of different European ethnicities, and then, oh dear heavens, when he gets to the Holy Land, it's even worse, right? And he's describing Bedouins and Arabs. So there's a kind of authenticity to it that I think, as he got older, more mature, and also I think more attuned to the sensibilities of his audience and not wanting to offend them. So it's The Innocents Abroad for me.
That's my favorite. Oh, how nice. Any other questions? Any from our in-person audience? Yes. So the question was about the archives and how much of Twain is published versus unpublished.
There is a lot a great deal has been published. This is the foundational purpose of the Mark Twain Project, to get published every significant thing that he wrote, including his notebooks. You know, every writer keeps a notebook always, you know, close at hand, and Twain was no exception to that. The notebooks, I believe, through 1891 have already been published, but remember, he doesn't die until 1910. And those were very active years, including the World Lecture Tour, which takes him to Australia, New Zealand, India, and South Africa. So, you know, there's a great deal of stuff that remains to be published. The Mark Twain Project has published 6 print volumes of his letters that take you up through 1875. The next installment, which we call Letter 7, which doesn't mean a whole lot, but that's 1876-77, and that has recently been published online. So the format of the letters moving forward will likely be solely digital. But, you know, one of the things, so again, think about it, from 1877 to 1910, that is a lot of years of letters. One of the amazing things that, you know, it was news to me once I got the job there, is that new Mark Twain letters are being discovered at the rate of about 3 a week. So it's a moving target in terms of how, you know, we'll ever get all of those letters published. Mark Twain wrote, you know, when he's that quote that I gave you, you know, where he says to his mother, "I'm just piling up manuscripts. You know, it's as easy for me to write this summer as it is to lie." Right? He prided himself on sort of, once he could get into that zone, all right, where his imagination was just kind of unleashed, he would write and write and write and produce voluminously, but not ever stop in the midst of that creation to revise. All right, revision came later. So, for example, A Tramp Abroad, which is the book about that 1878-79 journey to Europe, I don't want to give you a misleading percentage, but I'm going to say he wrote at least twice as much material as appears in the printed volume of A Tramp Abroad. So there's all of that stuff, you know, I mean, what you think of almost as like the outtakes, right, that didn't make it into the printed volumes.
Jody, you have a question?
We have a very active online audience, so
Alrighty.
I have 5
Oh, okay.
in the wings. So first, the easy one is based off that, you already answered about the 7th volume of letters. When will the definitive edition of Innocents Abroad come out?
Who asked that question?
John Pascal.
Well, funny you should ask, John, because we are now in the process of writing our next grant application to the National Endowment for the Humanities, and it includes a completion date for the Innocents Abroad. And I believe, don't quote me on this, but I think it's that we're going to finish up all the editorial work next year, hopefully for a print edition in 2025.
Very exciting. And I know John Pascal does not mind us calling him out. So the next question is, was there a specific point in his life where he changes his view of writing?
I guess, and at the risk of repeating myself, the older he gets, you know, the point at which he's really, you know, if not the most famous person in the world, one of them. I mean, you know, just immense celebrity. And I think that's the point at which he's really cultivating this notion of never a day's work, right? It's all just been play. It's been delicious play. And of course, you know, I think we have to take that with, you know, a large grain of salt, right? Because you can't produce that much wonderful, often brilliant material without a little bit of, effort and energy.
On that note, can you talk more about Twain's writing process during his the little darker works that come out later in life?
Well, this goes back to the question that was posed earlier about the unpublished material. There is, in that last decade of his life, he is, first of all, kind of acutely aware of his own mortality and worrying about the financial future of his two daughters, Clara and Jean, and therefore he becomes what I would call more risk averse in terms of, he doesn't want to publish anything. So, for example, he writes a very fiery piece called The United States of Lyncherdom, right? At one point, he's actually contemplating writing an entire book on lynching, kind of an expose, right? And within the letters around this are really fascinating because he's sort of a big head full of steam. This is what I'm going to do. It's going to have all these pictures, etc. And then I think it's 3 or 4 days later, he's like, yeah, no, I can't do that, right? I mean, because it's kind of, he realizes that that's much too risky in terms of, he says in the letter, and I'm going to paraphrase this badly, but you'll catch my drift. I wouldn't have a friend left in the South, right, if I published such a book. So, he does publish some very scathing criticisms of American missionaries, particularly in Asia, but he leaves a great deal of, he writes them, it's a kind of cathartic exercise for him, and then he promptly just puts them in a drawer, right? Never intending, right, that these will see the light of day. He also published What is Man, right, but did so anonymously because he thought that, the theology of it, right, was too extreme, and again, would alienate his audience, right, and his readers. I don't know if that answers the question.
I think that was a good answer.
Okay.
The next one is, were there any specific letters or works that prompted you for this lecture?
Well, I think actually where it began, I mean, I have to credit both of you, with your exhibit theme, and then when you asked me, hey, would you, consider doing a talk? I thought, yes, this would be, just the right topic to kind of pull all of that together. But I think it was really the lost earring, because I'm doing some research in what little spare time I have on Mark Twain's involvement with something called the Saturday Morning Club of Hartford, which was young local women between the ages of about 16 and 21. And much of that archive is over at the Stowe Center Research Library, but there are gaps in it. I mean, sort of maddeningly frustrating gaps. And so when I got the job at the Mark Twain Papers in 2019, I thought, well, if any of those missing pieces still exist, this is where they're going to be, right? And in particular, I was interested in that period right before, like 1878 to 1880, 81, in terms of his deepening involvement with this group of young women. And that's how we have file drawers that are organized chronologically. So quite literally, I pulled open the drawer that said Writings 1878. I was looking for Saturday Morning Club material, which I did not find, but I found The Lost Earring. And there's something about that story, and I don't know if it came across in the bits of it that I was reading to you. In some ways, it's a very uncharacteristic Mark Twain story. It's got a kind of almost a fairy tale aura around it, and the old stocking knitter, he just is infatuated with that phrase, and that sounds to me like one of the Greek fates. Right? I mean, she's knitting destiny, and there's a destiny that befalls him in happening to choose this particular house to rent for his writing den, and then getting distracted, all right, by this little drama, all right, that turns out to be something he can't turn away from, right? So I think that would be the starting point for it. And I've always loved those pictures of him in bed. I mean, I just...
They're great.
I mean, think about it. Those could only have been taken after Livy died. Could you imagine ever, you want to do what? She would never have permitted that, but I mean, we're talking, it's not quite Victorian times, but it's Edwardian times. The distinction between private and public spaces was really ironclad. I mean, and there he is in his jammies.
Right, with reporters around and
Reporters around,
she'd be horrified.
Yeah.
So it is 8 o'clock, so I want to be mindful of the time, but the questions keep rolling in. So how many more do you want to answer?
I've got time. I don't know if you all want to leave.
This one says, I know Mark visited Nikola Tesla. Do we know of any inspired work by their friendship?
Well, do you know what?
Not that I can think of. Not proof that he was directly inspired by Tesla.
No.
Bummer. Let's see. The next one is, are there other than storyboards and some rough notes for his Artemis Ward lecture, do you know of other outlines or rough notes that survive that reveal his earliest written evidence of his creative process?
Wow, that is really a huge question, and I wouldn't be able to answer that with any degree of confidence until I'm back in Berkeley and I can get into the vault and look. So I would be happy if
It's Kevin. You can email him.
Okay, I know. I was just going to say I know his email address. Aren't you on your way to Egypt, Kevin?
He always makes time for Twain.
He does always make
always
time for Twain. Yes. The last one at the moment on here that I see is, what have you learned about Twain's writing process, or maybe I mean his editing process, looking at manuscripts like Pudd'nhead and even Huck Finn?
Well, he was a meticulous editor. I mean, a really exacting editor. I mean, that famous quote about the difference between the right word and the almost right word. I mean, if there ever was a wordsmith, it was Mark Twain. What I think in terms of this particular talk, what really struck me, I mean, when we think about Mark Twain, we think of, a humorist, a satirist, right? But the descriptive language of those vistas, whether it be, from Quarry Farm or the Königstuhl in Heidelberg, or the description of the view from the house that he was renting in Dublin. These are really moving, magnificent descriptions. I mean, so painterly, and I think that that's an underappreciated quality in Mark Twain's writing. I mean, you can almost close your eyes and visualize those spaces, and just how sort of intoxicating and enchanting, to look at the vantage point that was like leagues and leagues, like line after line of mountains, almost a kind of vanishing perspective towards infinity, and that, I don't know, maybe it's a truism, but as I was writing this, it made me think, I mean, I suppose anyone would be inspired looking at scenery like that, but there's something about, this whole notion of the tank and the tank running dry, and then looking out at a scene like that, always the elevation, right? You can't be down in the, what did he call them, the salt flats or something, I mean, that's just boring. You need to be looking down from on high, like a scrub angel, right? That it makes his thoughts, right? I can push around the clouds and line up the stars and not be bothered with the human insects, right? There's something so liberating for him about that contemplation of nature. And that was, for me, a new insight or a realization.
Yep. Any other questions from our in-person audience before we wrap up? Now, I do want to end by saying it's funny that you mentioned that, because Jody and I went on a research trip for the exhibition, and we stayed in the cabin at Saranac Lake that the Clemenses stayed in. Mm-hmm. And we read his description of his view, and you had the same view. Yeah. And it was almost magical laying there, knowing you're looking at the same viewpoint that he did. And you're right, he's such a master of description that you almost felt transported back to when he was there. Yeah. So it's very interesting. But with that, I want to thank Kerry, as always, for coming here and giving a wonderful lecture. Thank you to our in-person and our virtual audience, and hope to see you all next time. Thank you and have a good night.